Mastering electronic dance music.
Hey, welcome back to Mastering EDM with Logic Pro, and this is the 7th video in our series introducing mixing. And today I'm going to be covering reverb. Like I touched on last week, reverb is essentially a lot of delays all lined up. So I have this bass line that I've been using for the past couple of videos, and I'm going to add a stereo delay on it and turn this up rather high. So we'll turn this up to 81. And then I'm going to turn off the beat sync and then change this to... let's set this to 80 here, and then we'll turn this up just a little bit so you can hear it better. So now I have this sound that it's a lot of delays really close, and it sounds essentially what reverb is like. And if I turn this down even shorter, you get more of an idea, except reverb is typically a lot longer. That sounds terrible, but that's the premise of reverb and in how it's designed and how it works. So I'll pull up Reverb. I do not like this reverb plugin, but for the purpose of kind of explaining what reverb is and how it works, it'll do fine. So right now what I have, I could turn down the density of this, and if I turn this down really low, it doesn't have as many repeats, so it kind of sounds like this. And if I have the decay set longer here, you get that repeating sound that just kind of bounces around. And so that's really, it shows that delay and reverb are essentially very connected. Now that said, you can get very different sounds if you use something like Space Designer, where it doesn't just repeat, but it also changes the shape of the sound while it's repeating. And that gets you very, very different results that typically give you a lot more variety, and they also tend to sound a lot nicer too. So I typically use Space Designer whenever I need a reverb. I don't think I've ever used another plugin to get me different reverb, just because Space Designer is so nice and it's got tons of options. So that's essentially what reverb is, and you know, off the bat, you kind of know why you would use it. Things with reverb tend to sound better than things without reverb. So it sounds a lot bigger, and it sounds a lot, you would say better. But the thing to consider is reverb, things can quickly get lost in a mix as a whole. Things will get muddy and they'll get blended over each other. And while the mix will blend, you won't be able to distinctly hear everything, and you won't be able to place different instruments in a stereo space. And it won't feel like a clean mix. It'll sound like one full mash of instruments that sound like they're together, but they don't exactly sound, I don't know, they don't sound like they're coordinated. They just kind of sound like they're blended. So you got to be careful with how much reverb you add. Now, one of the things that people love to do is people love to drown vocals in reverb. There is a time and place for this, but for regular vocals, you don't want to just throw as much reverb as you feel would be nice on there, because chances are it'll end up getting lost in the mix. In fact, I've heard a lot of trance mixes where reverb is very key, and the vocals do not have much reverb at all, but they instead have a lot of delay. So that's one thing you could use to kind of thin out all that extra body that reverb gives. You could put a little bit of reverb underneath the vocals and then just have delay so that you get that extra space, but at the same time you don't have the extended version of delay, which is reverb, filling up everything. You get it so you have enough body, but not enough to where everything is kind of flooded. Now, in a different case where you have vocals in trance songs where it's, for example, you have a part where it's pretty much just the vocals and maybe a pad in the background. There's a very high chance the vocals will have a lot of reverb in addition to the delay, and that's because the vocals are acting as almost like a leading instrument, so they need to have a lot of body. So if there's no other instruments running, you need to fill up that empty space with something. So reverb is tricky in the sense that you need enough but not too much, and it's very dependent on what instrument you're doing this on and what style of music you're running. I could give particular guidelines saying dubstep you want less reverb, trance you want more reverb, but your best bet is to decide what kind of music style you want and then implement reverb based on that. So a good example of this is there are many styles of electro house, but some of them employ means of more upfront bass lines, where others depend more on reverb to give a big spacious sort of sound. So it depends on what music style you prefer the most, and you should just listen to pro tracks and decide which ones you think would fit your style best, and then follow what they've done by way of how much reverb you add. So that's essentially what reverb is, and in terms of implementing it in a mix, I do have a few suggestions. The first one being that I do not think you should put a reverb plugin on every single track, and that means two things. First of all, not every track needs reverb, and also it's very it consumes the CPU processing power quite a bit if you have so many reverb plugins. So my suggestion is to use buses, which is routing the audio like we talked in buses and folders, to send it to a new track, and then you have a reverb, one single reverb unit, and you just determine how much you want to send to get that much reverb. That way you could have like 50 tracks sent into a single reverb unit instead of 50 tracks with different reverb units. And that also brings up the topic of reverbs and whether or not you should have individual ones for every track, or you should have one for your entire track. There's a balance, I honestly believe, that some tracks need a different reverb from other tracks, but at the same time, if you use too many different reverbs, what can happen is they conflict in their sound style, and you don't get a cohesive mix. You get something that sounds like it's been, once again, blended together instead of everything sounding like it's placed in a single space, and it's all coordinated and sounding good. So keep that in mind when you're throwing reverbs on. You don't want too many different reverbs, and if you have a lot of the same reverb, just throw it on one bus and send everything to that bus in varying amounts. Now, there's a couple other tips that I'll just bring up briefly. As you can see here, there is a chorus and a EQ on this. The chorus is disabled by default and the EQ is on, but there's nothing happening. And that brings up another thing with that. But for now, I want to briefly touch on why there's a chorus here. When you send sharp sounds into a reverb, typically what happens is you get a sort of flutter sound, and sometimes you don't want that, even though you want the rest of that particular instrument going through the reverb and giving you sound. So what chorus does is it kind of smooths it out, and you get a little bit more spacious of a feeling, and it gets rid of a little bit of those transients too, so it doesn't sound like it's very harsh and bright. It just kind of gives it a more space, and lets your original track cut through and the reverb flow underneath of it. So that's why chorus is there. You don't want to use it all the time, but there are some times where you'll think, you know what, it's sounding too bright right now. Let me just throw a chorus on it to kind of smooth things out, give it a little more space and stuff like that. So chorus is useful, but not something you should use every time. I will talk about more about what chorus does in the next video, which is going to be modulation and all the various types of that. I won't cover every single modulation plugin, but I will talk about generally what is modulation and how do you learn to use it. So finally, this is the last thing I'm going to talk about here. We have the EQ here on top of the Space Designer. Space Designer does have a built-in EQ, but I'll be honest, I don't like it. I use it occasionally, but it's more, you have more control if you work through these. The reason being, with reverb, and when you have a variety of things, you don't want the high end, you just want the mids. bright synths can create a lot of high end in reverb, and that can be a good thing. That can be what you want, but additionally, it can also really overlap your main track synth, the main synth that you're running, and cause it to get lost in the reverb entirely. If you cut out some of the high end, the original synth cuts through, but you also get the body of the reverb. Additionally, the low end you need to be very careful about, because reverb builds up low end just as easily as it builds up high end. And low end, a lot of low end reverb is like essentially always bad. The only reason you would have a lot of low end in your reverb is if you're stylizing something and you're not using it as a mixing technique, you're using it as a production technique. So you definitely want to keep in mind how much low end you have. And when I say low end, I mean for reverb, it's generally about we'll say 400 to 20 hertz, 20 hertz to 400 hertz. So 500 is not as much of an issue, but when you get around 200 and below, you could get some very, very, very bad buildup that that will instantly make your track sound muddy. So you want to cut that or reduce it by using a shelf or a peak, depending on what instrument you're using and what the nature of it is. That said, you can use it, like I said, you could use it to stylize. And an example to where you might use that is if you have a bass line and you want to give it some, you want to give it a different kind of tone, but you don't want to EQ it. What you can do is you could send it through a reverb plugin. My suggestion would be to do that not through a bus, but what you can do is you can add some reverb and then boost some of the low end and then re-EQ your bass, and you get a different tone because the reverb adds a sort of a different sort of vibe to it. And it doesn't necessarily have to have a long tail. You could just, when choosing Space Designer, choose a smaller space, and you'll get more of a tone change than a change in the length of the particular sound of the bass line. So that's why you would put an EQ there, and that's why it's important to have an EQ there. You don't always have to EQ, but it's definitely a good thing to check on if you're unsure as to why your mix is sounding is not sounding clear enough or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot of instruments that sound good with more reverb and others that sound very bad with reverb. But I don't want to go into that too much. I mostly just want to talk about, like I said, all this the idea of learning how to use these tools so that you can stylistically implement them and use them for mixing. My biggest suggestion whenever you have questions as to what will sound good is to listen to your favorite tracks, because one of the things I've learned over the years is if you listen to a track, normally you don't get as much as if you go in and pick out, like, specifically listen to a track and listen to the reverb. So okay, what reverb are they using on this instrument? Are they using any on this one? How have they EQ'd it? What else have they done to it? If you focus on one particular part of a track and listen to it through the track, you get a whole different perspective of the track than if you just listen to it as a whole and listen to what you like and don't like usually. So my biggest suggestion is listen to your favorite tracks and kind of figure out what they use to get that sound that you like so much, and then you could start implementing that into your own tracks. So that's it for this episode. Like I said, the next episode is going to be on modulation, which is going to cover a variety of plugins. It'll be rather brief on that one, but mainly I want to talk about the concept of how it functions and what you would generally use it for. So that's it. If you like this video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, or anything. If you have a suggestion for a video I should do, feel free to leave that in the comments or send me a message or something, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. But until then, stay posted. I've been coming out with a couple more videos than usual lately, but my schedule is to get one out at least every Saturday. So stay posted Saturday, and feel free to check throughout the week because I might get something else up along the way too. That's it. See ya.